Quorum Radio, baby.
You're listening to Quorum Radio on WRMI 5850.
Quorum Radio now on with Joseph McBride. We had him on the other day, and he's, remember, he's the author of the book Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit. He's an author of 22 books, and his newest release will be in October. It's a Columbia University Press book called Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge, to be released October 19th. Be ready for that book. Sure, it'll be a great one. He's somebody who's got a very, very strong background as a film historian, biographer, screenwriter, professor at the Center Department of San Francisco State University. Joseph McBride has published many books, has stated 22. He's also the man who wrote biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, Steven Spielberg. His most recent book prior to this, I take it if this is accurate, is The Broken Places, a 2015 memoir. Great. Well, it's great to have you on again, Joseph.
Great to be back.
Radio had a number of interesting topics that we could not cover because the JFK assassination and the J.D. Tippit murder are multifaceted, very complex, lots of moving parts, lots of interesting players, and there was a tremendous amount of research that went into it. This is not a simple, open and shut murder case.
No,
I think
it's the Tippit case is a cold case of 57 years now, and you could say the same about the Kennedy murder, because nobody was ever brought to trial for either murder. Lee Harvey Oswald was charged with both murders. He was never arraigned for the murder of President Kennedy, only for the murder of Tippit, strangely enough. And then he was killed in the police station by Jack Ruby, a local mobster, with 60 policemen around and a lot of media people on live TV, and a lynching in the police station. So justice was never served. And the Tippit case I decided to focus on because it was really uninvestigated pretty much. The Warren Commission hardly looked at it, and the Dallas police basically dropped the investigation when Oswald was killed. And it should have gone on. A brother officer was killed, and they should have wrapped it up. And they just kind of, Jim Lavelle, who was the lead detective on the case, told me, he said, well, I kept looking into leads and things, but it was clear they didn't do much. And then the House Select Committee on Assassinations did some more digging on it. They came up with a few things, but not a lot. And Sylvia Meagher, who wrote a great book on the case called Accessories After the Fact in 1967, described Tippit as unknown and unknowable, and I took that as a kind of a challenge. She took that from she did a real dissection of the Warren Report and really destroyed it, but she was struck by the fact that there was so little on him in the Warren Report, and even though they claim that was they have only 8 proofs in the Warren version of Oswald killing Kennedy. That's all it comes down to is 8 proofs. And in my book, Into the Nightmare, I take each one apart. They're easy to disprove. But one of them is that he killed Tippit, which is not logical because let's say if you did kill a policeman, it doesn't prove you killed somebody else. Of course. You have to make a link between the two, and they didn't really do that,
Right. So the testimony of the taxi driver, Scoggins, Ted Calloway, Sam Ginyard, all disqualified. Why?
Well, you mean not by me or by other people?
Well, let's by the facts. Let's say by the facts.
Well, it's a very complicated murder scene, and it took me a long time. It took 31 years to write this book, and one of the things that took a long time was trying to piece together what happened at the scene, and it's very complicated and not entirely clear. There were about 20 witnesses or 22 witnesses who claimed to have seen all or part of the shooting or the aftermath, somebody running away. And 12 of them, I believe, identified Oswald as the shooter, and then 10 refused to identify Oswald. And then there were a few people who didn't see anybody, who came, a little too late. But of the 12 who identified Oswald, there are problems with those witnesses. I think it was 5, if I'm not mistaken, identified him in a lineup. It was very easy to identify him in a lineup because he was the only one disheveled and wearing a t-shirt and looking beat up, And some of them only identified him weeks later under strange circumstances, like Warren Reynolds identified him after he was shot in the head by an intruder in his car lot, after he told the FBI, I can't identify the shooter. And he said he tried to chase the whoever was fleeing, but he said, I couldn't identify him. And he was shot 2 days later in the head. He survived. And then he said, oh, okay, yeah, it was Oswald. And then there was Domingo Benavides, who's the closest person to the shooting. He was 15 feet away in his pickup truck. He pulled over to the side when he heard the shots, and he looked, and he wouldn't identify Oswald, so they didn't take him to the lineup. I mean, that's the kind of police work they did. Well, he didn't identify Oswald, so we're not going to ask you, And then he wouldn't identify him before the Warren Commission either. But 3 years later, CBS interviewed him for one of their specials on the case, and he said, yeah, it was Oswald. But in the interim, he had received a lot of threats, and his brother, who looked a lot like him, had been shot to death in a bar. And so there were a lot of intimidations, of the Tippit scene. A lot of people were killed or shot at or intimidated, more so than, I mean, there were other Kennedy witnesses and people involved in the case were killed, but in the Tippit murder, there was a very high concentration of problems for the witnesses. So the witness testimony is a mess. And the Warren Commission relied on basically one person, Helen Markham, who was a waitress who was going for her bus. But she said the murder took place at 1:06 p.m. And one of the reasons Oswald couldn't have done it is he was seen outside his rooming house at 1:04 p.m. by his the housekeeper, and she saw him standing there waiting for a bus or a car, and a police car pulled up outside and honked the horn. Anyway, he was there at 1:04. He couldn't have gotten to the scene at 1:06. That's what Helen Markham said was the time of the shooting. It may have been a little later, 1:08, 1:09. Tippit tried to call the police on his radio at 1:08, and there was no answer. Oswald couldn't have even, sprinted to the location if he had been a great runner, but nobody saw him running. So there were a lot of problems like that, basically. And Markham was called an utter screwball by one of the Warren attorneys, one of the counsel. And she fainted several times during the lineups and had to be revived. And she was completely confused when she testified. And they had to prompt her, as to who she saw at the lineup. It was farcical. If you read it's kind of unintentionally funny that she said, well, I didn't see anybody at the lineup. And they said, well, didn't you see number 4? I think it was. And, oh yeah, number 4, whatever, Wow. I mean, it was a total botch. And some people saw two men involved. I mentioned in our previous talk, Aquila Clemens was a good witness. She was a domestic working half a block away, and she heard the shots, and she came out and she saw 2 men running in opposite directions, and one kind of waved to the other, like go off, signaling him to go off in a different direction. And she was threatened by the police shortly after the assassination. Don't talk to anybody. And she disappeared after doing a interview with Mark Lane. You can see it on YouTube for the film Rush to Judgment. So she saw 2 people, and neither one looked like Oswald. She said one was kind of short and chunky and bushy hair, and the other guy was kind of lanky and tall. And Oswald was kind of a short, thin guy. He didn't, So
sure. I mean, he was not. He was a pretty fit guy. He wasn't fat. He was probably a normal height. I mean.
Yeah, he's 5'9",
right?
5'9", wiry. He wasn't short. He wasn't tall. He was average height, but he was thin. But he was this man she described seemed lankier than Oswald, and the other guy was short and heavy. And there was anyway, other people had described a short, chunky guy with bushy hair at the scene. It was one of the shooters, and that doesn't describe Oswald. It could describe Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby might have been at the scene. And one of the interesting things about the case, and we can get into witnesses and suspects, but we really didn't do that last time about.
Sure. We have a number of things to discuss. One is that your contention, Joseph, that Officer J.D. Tippit was ambushed.
Yeah, I think that's my conclusion. Now, one of my most interesting discoveries, I interviewed his father, Edgar Lee Tippit, who was 90 years old, very sharp. He was still working as a farmer, and he was living in East Texas. Very interesting old man. And he told me that Mrs. Tippit, the widow of the policeman, Marie Tippit, who died recently, told him shortly after the assassination she'd been visited by a policeman whose name he didn't remember, who told her what happened. She said this policeman came and said, JD and I were both sent to track down Oswald in Oak Cliff, which is where Oswald lived. And I got into a car accident and nearby and didn't make it on time. And JD got there and he got killed. And this policeman felt guilty about it because he said, if I'd gotten there, maybe I would have gotten shot and not JD. And then I figured out through various ways that this officer was William Menzel, who was actually the officer assigned to the district. JD was out of his district. They were former partners. And Menzel claimed he was having lunch during the time of the assassination and kind of dallied in the restaurant, which is kind of peculiar, And some of the officers had strange excuses for where they were. And then Menzel, I did find out there was a car accident about 2 blocks from the Tippit shooting within 2 minutes of that time. And the Menzel was the officer who was sent on the police radio to the accident, and he cleared the accident within, I think it was 2 or 3 minutes, something, it's very unusual for an officer to arrive and write it up and clear it that fast. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I suspected maybe Menzel had the accident, and that it was put down in the records as Menzel investigating an accident. But anyway, he always felt bad about it. But the point, what's important about that story is that Tippit and Menzel were sent by the Dallas police around 12:45 or earlier, and they didn't know officially, according to the official record, who Oswald was until 2:10. The police, they arrested him at 1:52 in the theater nearby, and he had 2 different sets of IDs on him, and they didn't know what his name was until they got him to the police station at about 2:10. So at 12:45, officially, according to the Warren report and the police, they didn't know who the suspect was until they got a report somebody went into the theater without paying. But so somebody had to have, in the police department, they knew who Oswald was, and it is quite clear from all the research I've done that they were aware of Oswald's presence. I mean, he was a defector to the Soviet Union, and he was considered a subversive. We could talk about Oswald. He was not what he appeared to be, but they knew who he was, and they had his address and everything. And so this was a setup, and why were these 2 officers sent after him? Were they sent to arrest him or to kill him? And we don't know for sure, but I would lean in the direction of they were sent to kill him, because there's evidence at the theater that policemen were going to try to kill him there, and they couldn't because there were too many civilians around. And then, of course, he was killed in the police station. So Tippit and Menzel were part of the plot in some way. And so I believe Tippit rode into an ambush, and we can talk about why that.
Sure. Although, I'll be honest with you, I think I've seen, we got a little earthquake in Peru.
Really?
1 second. We got a quake.
Oh my God.
One of the things that my impression of things is that it was an utterly, par excellence, atypical day. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think you and I know it means that when something like that happens, you're not going to be saying, looking at your watch, you're not going to be saying, hey, this guy's running into my rooming house. I'm the housekeeper. He could be a presidential assassin.
No,
You know,
she didn't have a clue what he was doing.
of course.
Yeah.
Although, and then there's something else is that people say, well, nobody saw him running. Well, okay. I mean, this is something I've said before. Look at somebody like Oswald. He was not that old, and he was pretty fit.
Yeah.
He had low body mass index. He was pretty strong. Some people say that Nick McDonald at the theater almost got his butt kicked, and I can believe it. Oswald was a street kid from New Orleans. He was not and he lived in the Bronx. He was not a pushover. And he had been pushed around and picked on, and he gave as good as he got, I think. But what my point is that he had a high energy level. People were looking at their TVs and listening to their radios. They were not looking, saying, Mitch, have you seen any potential suspects? No, they were glued. And so what I say in this is that they say 1 o'clock and 1:04. Well, it could be. It could be give or take. And the give or take is something that you definitely have to keep in mind.
There are things, I mean, like you have to check and double check and triple check every single fact or piece of evidence in the case against everything else. And I think there are some barometers we could look at, though. Mrs. Roberts, who was the housekeeper, said it was 1:03 to 1:04, and I guess she looked at her watch, and she was watching TV, and she was saying, they were reporting the president was shot. Anyway, then it was 9/10 of a mile from the rooming house to the Tippit scene. So if you're running very fast, you could make it in 5 or 6 minutes if you're a terrific runner.
Oh, no, less. Well, yeah, actually, no, you're right. You're correct.
You have to be a really good runner to make it in
6 minutes, 7 minutes. No, you're
5
right.
minutes. No. Well, I'm trying to be as, like if you're wearing street clothes and shoes and you're running on the street or sidewalk.
That makes sense. 7 minutes. I mean, the thing about it is that, I mean, sure, people said they didn't see him. At one point, somebody said they did see him, right?
They didn't find anybody who said they saw anybody walking that route or running that route. They just said that somebody appeared near the police car. That's the first time he was sighted. And also, witnesses said he came from the 2 different directions, too. That's another confusing factor.
Sure, that's it. Sure.
But Mrs. Markham, who said it was 1:06, now it is known that she was going to catch her bus, which came every day at 1:12, a block away. And she wasn't going to miss her bus, because if she did, she'd be late for work, So she said she left home and she looked at her clock on the wall, and I think she said it was like 1:04 when she left home, a block away, and she was walking toward the bus. So that time frame 1:06, 1:08 is approximately believable. And then I interviewed a witness, T.F. Boley, who was the only person at the scene who looked at his watch. And he was a man who was driving on a nearby street a block away, and he saw the commotion, and he saw a policeman on the ground next to his car. So he pulled left, and he pulled up a couple hundred yards from the policeman. He had his daughter in the car, and he told her to wait in the car, and he got out to see what was happening. And he told me he looked at his watch, and it was 1:10. Yeah. And he's the only person there who's known to look at a watch. And he seemed like a reliable guy. And I said, did you have a good watch? He said, well, yeah. I mean, as far as I know, I always had a good watch. Sure. I mean, a watch could be off by a minute or something. But so the approximate, but what the Warren Commission tried to do is claim the murder took place at 1:15. And that is a considerable difference between, 1:06 and 1:10 and 1:15. And that would have given Oswald enough time to walk to the scene. That's why they shifted the time. And then the other documents are very reliable. I mean, often reliable. But for example, the ambulance service that picked up Tippit was only a couple blocks away. There was a funeral home nearby that doubled as an ambulance service. And they got there at 1:19. And they took Tippit to Methodist Hospital, and I believe he was DOA'd about 1:25, I believe. And there was an alteration in the hospital record. I believe they changed a time. They fiddled with times in the records to make it look like Oswald could have gotten there. It just seems impossible for Oswald to have gotten there in time to kill Tippit. That's one of the basic problems with the case, along with, but even more important, I mean, that's awfully important, but the gun that allegedly killed Tippit, they could not match the bullets found in Tippit with the gun. There was an FBI expert, Cortland Cunningham, who testified to the Warren Commission, who was clearly an honest man, who said that the bullets were too mangled and they could not be linked to the revolver. And there was also a police report that the shooting was done with an automatic, and an automatic. They found some shells nearby that they tried to link to the revolver, and the shells and the bullets were allegedly of different makes. And there was also a problem. One of the officers who claimed he initialed one of the shells actually didn't initial it. And, so the ballistics evidence exonerates Oswald. And there's no proof. John Armstrong did a really good book on Oswald called Harvey and Lee, and he did a whole chapter on the revolver and a whole chapter on the rifle that allegedly killed Kennedy. And he proved through tremendous research that there's no proof that Oswald owned either weapon. He never received them. He didn't own them. He didn't purchase them, so the weapon, if you had a trial, that's the kind of thing that would exonerate Oswald. Is there's no ballistics evidence, and the eyewitness evidence could be, taken different ways, et cetera. But
sure. I think it didn't happen that I think Ted Calloway or maybe Sam Ginyard saw Oswald with a pistol. He was about maybe 50 feet away, and he said it looked like an automatic.
Well,
right?
Calloway was
thinking like 1911 or something.
He was a block away. He was a car dealer. He saw a guy running down an alleyway, and he came to the scene, and then he picked up Tippit's handgun, and he took it with him, and he commandeered the taxi cab.
Goggins' taxi is amazing.
And they said, let's go off and find the guy. And so there's a chain of evidence of Tippit's gun was broken by this. And then he came back. He was kind of a hot-headed guy who thought he was like a vigilante. And they didn't find anybody, and he came back and put the gun back, and then it was,
Oh my gosh, it was another time. I mean, can you imagine somebody doing that today?
Yeah, and then there was a carload of guys who were going hunting, and they had rifles and stuff, and they saw this guy, running around with a handgun, and they thought he was the killer, and they confronted Calloway too. I mean, a lot of crazy stuff was happening. But one of the things that was disturbing about people have found out about the evidence is that there were two young women named the Davis sisters, Virginia and Jeanette. They lived at the house right at the corner there where Tippit was shot, very close. They came outside the moment they heard the shooting, and they said one of them said policemen were there at the time, which does not jibe with the official record. The official record was that no other policeman arrived for like 10 minutes, I believe. And that's led some researchers such as John Armstrong to talk about Kenneth Croy, who was a reserve officer who said he was the first officer on the scene. And he claimed he came, a few minutes after Tippit was shot, but he might have been there. And Armstrong suggested maybe Croy and another policeman, Westbrook, were at the scene. I mentioned that there was a police car in the alleyway. A woman across the street, Doris Holan, said there was a police car in the alley, and the shooter came from the police car, shot Tippit, and then he went over to Tippit, and to make sure he was dead, he fired another shot into Tippit's head, and then he went back in the police car, and the police car backed away into the alley. You could get to Jefferson Boulevard through the alleyway.
Right. Okay. Well, look, I mean, as far as the ballistics issue, the bullets that they removed from Tippit's body, and supposedly one found outside, maybe in the ambulance that fell out, but.
Well, that's another loose end. You know, there's so many loose ends. The whole thing was so poorly investigated. One of the ambulance drivers said a bullet fell out of Tippit's uniform or body in the ambulance, and they didn't enter it into evidence, and they should have, you know. But in my book, what I do is I go through a bunch of possible suspects of the Tippit case, and I'm not talking right now about Croy and Westbrook, but I go through people who have been mentioned or that who are in the vicinity or might have been involved, and I try to eliminate some, and some I think are still question marks. There were two or three that I think are seriously questionable. One is a guy named Daryl Garner, who was a young hoodlum who was associated with Jack Ruby. And Garner was a burglar and a pimp, and he was the guy who probably shot Warren Reynolds, the witness to the Tippit shooting, which is interesting. He
boasted, T.F. Boley, who also knew Jack Ruby as a bouncer.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of the Boley wasn't involved in the shooting, but he worked for Jack Ruby. And a lot of the witnesses knew Ruby or worked for him or whatever, which is another interesting aspect. It seems like the witnesses were possibly staged. It almost seems like there are two sets of witnesses. But let me just finish up on Garner. Garner confessed to his sister. Go ahead. Garner called his sister on the phone when Reynolds was shot and said, I shot Reynolds in the head. And he was drunk when he said that, and then he later tried to deny it. But he produced an alibi witness who was his girlfriend, who was one of Jack Ruby's strippers. And she was arrested soon after that and put in prison, and she allegedly hanged herself in the cell, you know, which is kind of strange. So Garner was interviewed by Mark Lane, who wrote one of the most important books on the case, Rush to Judgment. Garner wanted to be represented by Mark Lane, and Lane did a long interview with him, and Garner gave all kinds of claims about Ruby and Oswald knowing each other, and he claimed that Clay Shaw offered him money to kill Kennedy, and some of these maybe wild stories that this criminal told, but he died of a heroin overdose soon after that. But he claimed that Will Fritz, the chief of homicide in Dallas, was threatening his life, and he may have been possibly one of the people who shot Tippit. You know, he was that. There are other things I write about this at some length in my book. I think he's the kind of guy who might have been recruited by Ruby to be involved in that. And there was another officer, Harry Olsen, who's a very suspicious character, who was in that neighborhood. He admitted being in the neighborhood. He claimed he was guarding a house nearby, and they could never really pin down what house it was. And he was dating a Ruby stripper who he married soon after that. And that night, Olsen and this stripper, Kay Coleman, sat in a car with Jack Ruby for 2 or 3 hours, and they were telling him to kill Oswald. You know, they were egging him on, and that's very suspicious too. And Olsen was a really dirty cop, and but he was fired by Chief Curry in early December for reasons that are not clear. And he and his girlfriend left Dallas, and he was a very suspicious character. What was he doing in Oak Cliff, and was he possibly involved? You know, people like that. You know?
Right, these are people. Yeah, interesting characters. And you know, a question I want to ask is that you know, again, I'm a one more student that is learning, but regarding things that we can hang our hat on, you know, here I am with a hat and the jacket. It's my Jack Ruby Miami Beach hat. Yeah, you got to go there with Jack Ruby, you know,
police detective hat.
Exactly right, from Miami Beach.
Right.
Is that supposedly Tippit is an interesting guy because he mentions 110. He was going on vacation that day, I understand. Possibly could have been a little bit distracted. Maybe he didn't wind his watch, but then again, let's assume that let's assume his watch was pretty accurate.
You mean Boley, T.F. Boley, yeah.
Yeah. Right. He knows Jack Ruby, like you said. He worked for him, or I thought he did deliveries. Maybe he's a bouncer. Okay. But he was the guy after Domingo Benavides tried to make the police radio work to call the police. and does it unsuccessfully. He was able to do it. He knew something about electronics,
Well,
apparently, right?
his profession was radio. He was a radio man, and he knew how to operate a police radio. Yeah, Benavides didn't, so he was trying to do it, and he couldn't get through, and then Boley picked it up, and so Boley, I think, is a his testimony is reliable. The only thing is, when I interviewed him, he said he'd never been interviewed before.
That's amazing.
I did find out. I mean, it shows you the lack of interviews that went on. The police did interview him, and he was interviewed by the House Select Committee. He didn't mention either of those, but no researcher had ever called him. He was in the phone book, and he was easy to talk to. But he told me that he had gone into Ruby's club as a young man. A lot of young men in Dallas had been in Ruby's clubs, which was not unusual, but he didn't volunteer to me that he had worked for Ruby. He had been a doorman, I found this out in 2010. He was given an award by the city of Dallas for what he did that day. And the story said, yeah, he worked for like 6 or 7 years as a doorman for Ruby, which sounds like a bouncer to me in one of Ruby's clubs.
Well, yeah, that's it. Yeah, sure. But I mean, the UK, if you're a doorman, you're there to let people in and kick them out.
Yeah, and he also so he didn't, but he had told that to the House Select Committee, but he didn't tell me. So I find that a little odd, but I mean, that's another example of a lot of people had connections to Ruby that maybe we don't even know about all the connections they had. Like Helen Markham, the waitress who was the key witness for the Warren Commission, she knew Ruby well because he came in her diner quite often with his strippers at night. The diner was near Ruby's club downtown, and so they were friendly. And Ruby had a roommate, a male roommate, who ate there every day, and he knew her too. So there are these connections between people. Ruby could have maneuvered these people into place, and Ruby was dropping a lot of hints to the Warren Commission when he testified in the jail before Earl Warren and Gerald Ford. It's extraordinary testimony. People should read it. It's very disturbing and very sad in a way. And he was hinting that he was really involved in the assassination, and he wanted to talk about it. And they just didn't want to hear what he had to say. And he said, if you get me to Washington, I'll tell you everything. But he feared for his life because he was in the Dallas County Jail, and he was really afraid for his life if he talked. And he would say things like, he was hinting that he was really involved in the conspiracy, et cetera. And even said that some people have claimed that I was the assassin of the president. Warren says to him, nobody's told us that of the hundreds of people we talked to. And Ruby said, yes, but you don't know the situation here, and things like that.
Sure. Well, sure. There's a number of topics. So one of which, of course, is, the whole issue, and we have to get into Tippit. I mean, why do you think the ambush would have occurred?
Well, after all these years, you can't give definitive answers to every question. I did the best I could in 31 years. And I'm glad that's one reason I wrote this book, and one reason I write any book is partly to find answers and correct myths and errors, but also to hope to get other people interested, to get other people to write books and look into it. And it has renewed interest in the Tippit case, so other people have tried to do further research, which is great. It's hard because a lot of the people are dead, or there are some people still around, but and a lot of documents have been destroyed. But anyway, so you have to kind of come up with some possibilities of what happened. And it seems to me that this ambush, there could be 2 or 3 reasons for it. One is a very cynical reason, that they wanted to draw police cars into Oak Cliff because Oswald was around Oak Cliff and they wanted to kill him. And the thing that gets policemen most upset is a police killing. It's a natural thing they get upset about. And I listened to the police radio transmissions on tape, and they're very blasé when they talk about Kennedy being shot. And then when they say an officer was shot down in Oak Cliff, suddenly everybody gets very excited, and the transmissions get faster and faster. And I asked Detective Lavelle, I said, am I correct in assuming that a policeman's death got the department more upset than the president's death? And he said, yeah, that's when a policeman is killed, that takes precedence over everything, even the shooting of the president. And then he said something, and I won't use the exact word because it's a bad word. He said, there's an old saying, he had a little kind of evil smile on his face. He said, there's an old saying that, I said, how did you regard the president's death? How did the policeman think of the president being shot? And he said, well, there's an old saying, it wasn't no different than a South Dallas N-word shooting, he said.
Yeah.
I mean, that shows you the mindset. There are so many racists among the police department. I was interviewing Morris Brumley, who was a retired detective who was Tippit's oldest friend on the force. He knew him from boyhood, so he was a good source. But anyway, he and I were having lunch in a diner, a little restaurant, and Brumley pulled out his wallet and he showed me his Ku Klux Klan membership card. Can you imagine? He was proud of it. He was showing it to me, and I was, I had my tape recorder going and right in front of us, and he was talking about it, and I was reading off the card, so I had it, and I said, well, what's the story there? And he said, well, I infiltrated the Klan for the Dallas police, and I told another researcher who lived down there, and he laughed. He said, infiltrated. He said about 3/4 of the Dallas Klan were Dallas policemen, And so he was telling me really awful things, that he was involved in castrating and other terrible things to black.
What year was this?
That I did this interview, I think it was 1993. Brumley's dead.
83 or 93?
93. I was down in Dallas a lot, but I spent several months down there in 92, 93. But anyway, Brumley, I was trying, when you're interviewing somebody and they're telling you terrible things, you try to just keep them talking and get as much on the record as possible. So I didn't say, isn't that horrible? You're on, KKK.
Of course.
I finally felt like I had to say something. So I said, well, when they were doing these violent things, did you turn anybody into the police if you were infiltrating the Klan? And then he kind of clammed up because he got the import of what I was saying. It's like, in other words, if you were infiltrating them, why didn't you arrest people?
It's horrible. I mean, so many bad things that happened. I mean, there's a lot of brutality. But
that shows you the mindset of a lot of the policemen were extremely reactionary and right-wing and racist. Tippit, though, I tried to find out about his political beliefs, and I couldn't find any evidence of him being a racist per se, or any, not much political activity. His wife claimed that she and he voted for Kennedy, but I don't know if that's true. But I interviewed Austin Cook, who was a guy who ran a barbecue joint nearby, who was an interesting man. He was a member of the John Birch Society, a very right-wing fellow, and he was Tippit's boss. Tippit had a couple weekend jobs to supplement his income, which is interesting. And one of them, he was a security guard at Austin's Barbecue, which was right near the police station in that area. And he was there on weekends to take care of unruly teenagers, basically. And he was seen as a kind of not a very nice man who would push teenagers around, etc. But Austin was very right-wing, and he had a lot of right-wing connections. He knew General Edwin Walker, and Bill Alexander, who was a super right-wing deputy DA, would come in Austin's Barbecue. A lot of these right-wingers would come in there. And one of the most interesting connections, Austin Cook's former business partner was a guy named Bert Bowman, who was the partner of Ralph Paul. Ralph Paul was a mob-connected guy who was Jack Ruby's financier. Like, he was the guy who gave Jack Ruby his money to run the clubs and start the clubs. And so there's a connection between Austin and Jack Ruby through this guy, Ralph Paul, who is a suspicious character in the whole assassination story. So my point here is that Tippit was in this diner, this barbecue joint, for 3 years, and all these right-wingers were coming in and out all the time. They would have noticed him. He was wearing a uniform, and they would have known who he was, and that's where he could have been recruited into a plot.
Sure. All right. So and J.D. Tippit as badge man.
Yeah, J.D. Tippit. Now this is a theory that I thought about for a while. As early as the 80s, I began thinking about this. For people who don't know, some people will know about this, but there was a famous photograph by Marianne Moorman, Polaroid taken about 15 feet, 20 feet from the car. She was standing right near the car at the time of the fatal shot. She snapped an important Polaroid, and it shows Kennedy's head going backward. And you see in the background the fence, picket fence, and this concrete retaining wall on the grassy knoll. And there is a lot of evidence that there was somebody firing from behind the wooden fence. And there is also evidence that somebody was firing from behind the concrete retaining wall, because Kennedy was shot from the front at least once or twice. He was shot in the throat and he was shot in the head probably twice from the front. And there were shots fired from behind, but this is a whole other area. But the point is that the photograph has been analyzed by various people. Gary Mack was the first person who noticed. Well, actually, there were people before that who said there are people seen in that picture. It's very murky, unfortunately, because it's a Polaroid and it wasn't the highest quality. But Jack White was a very good photo researcher in Fort Worth who analyzed a lot of pictures of Oswald to show that there were really two Oswalds, et cetera. He did a couple documentaries on that. And he was a very serious, thoughtful guy. And he gave me a good interview, and he showed me photographic techniques, and he enhanced the Mormon picture, not by changing it, but you can print it in different ways. So you have different levels of light, different darkness, and and you can bring out details. And he was the one who brought out details that it appears to show somebody in a Dallas policeman's uniform firing a looks like a long pistol of some kind, or not a rifle, but a handgun of some kind. And you see the man, he's hatless, and you can see the badge. They had a shoulder patch that was distinctive, and they had a badge, and you could see a muzzle flash in front of his face. And there were a total of seven photographic images of this guy behind the wall, taken by different photographers at that time. And the person moved, and the House Select Committee studied this in great detail and concluded there was probably a human being behind the wall because of flesh tones and the movement of the shape. And but it looks like a Dallas policeman or somebody dressed as a Dallas policeman. But one thing I began thinking was, well, could this be a reason Tippit was killed soon after the assassination, to eliminate one of the assassins? Because one of the things that is often done in assassination is they kill the actual shooter. Well, this often happens. They eliminate the actual shooter, and then they blame it on a patsy, and sometimes they'll kill the patsy, and they'll say, well, this guy did it, but the real shooter got killed. I mean, so anyway, it is possible. I just thought, well, maybe Tippit was killed to eliminate him being involved in the plot. But one thing I noticed in my research, in the Warren volumes, there are 26 volumes, there are only two pictures of Tippit, which is strange. And one was 1952 and one was 1957. And neither one, they weren't current. And 57 picture, he was wearing a hat and you couldn't see his face very well. And there was no recent picture of him. And I began wondering, were they trying to hide what he looked like? And I hadn't seen pictures anywhere else of him because, they didn't want people saying, well, I saw that guy, in Dealey Plaza or whatever. So but I noticed in the Badgeman photograph that the shooter has a kind of receding hairline, and he has a kind of peculiar notch in his hairline. It looks like a kind of a semicircle notch. It's kind of very distinctive. And then I went to the Sixth Floor Museum at one point. They had an exhibit on Tippit. And Larry Ray Harris, who was a very good Tippit researcher who unfortunately died in a car crash, told me he gave them this picture that he came up with. One of Tippit's friends in the police force gave him this photo of Tippit in 1962 at a family gathering, and they had that picture there. And he had the same hairline, receding hair with that very distinctive notch. He looked a lot older. He was pretty weathered looking when he died. He was only 39, but he didn't look like the younger pictures much. And then I found another picture in the Dallas paper, and 2 days after the assassination, there was a picture, a little younger, but the hairline looked similar. So I began wondering, oh, is it possible that he was firing a shot and in a policeman's uniform? You know, a policeman would be unnoticed because shots were coming from different directions, and a policeman could be seen as firing back or whatever. And there are other witnesses who were in that area who gave different accounts, and we could go into that. But you know, part of the thing is that for Tippit to have done that, though, he would have had to get from Dealey Plaza at 12:30 to Oak Cliff by about 12:45, because he was seen at a gas station. He did some strange things in the 40 some minutes between the assassination and his death. He was seen at a gas station parked looking at the viaduct coming from downtown. There was a viaduct that went directly downtown. It took about 5 minutes to get from Dealey Plaza to Oak Cliff, and he was seen there by 5 people, and they recognized him because they knew him. And then he took off at a high rate of speed, and people have supposed that he was waiting for Oswald to come by in a cab or a bus, and the bus came by and there was no Oswald on it. And so he took off, and then he's heard on the police radio giving a kind of false report of his whereabouts. And then he's seen at a record store on Jefferson Boulevard about 1 o'clock, which is about 8 or 9 minutes before he's shot. This was Jefferson Boulevard was the main drag. It was a few blocks from where he was shot. He runs into this record store, which is still there, and he, without saying a word, he goes to a telephone, which is still there, and he makes a phone call, and they recognize him, the 2 guys running the record store. They knew him, and he dialed a number, and he didn't say anything, and it isn't clear if he heard anything or not, but he hung up and he ran out, and he looked very frazzled, and he got in his police car and took off toward 10th Street, which is parallel to Jefferson. He was killed on 10th Street. And then there was a further incident. Greg Lowry discovered this. There was a guy named James Andrews who was driving his car down 10th Street. He's an insurance man, and Tippit pulled him over. He suddenly just, pulled in front of him with his police car, jumped out, and Andrews saw the name tag Tippit, and Tippit looked in the back of his car as if to see if there was somebody there. He was probably looking to see if Oswald was in his car, and he didn't see anybody. So he jumped back in his car and took off. And that's the last sighting of him before he drove to his death a few blocks away. So these are signs of frantic behavior of Tippit looking for Oswald. And but did he have time to get from Dealey Plaza to Oak Cliff? And is there evidence? And I think it's inconclusive.
Yeah, it's a lot of interesting topics.
Well, let me bring up a
Sure.
possibly exonerating piece of this. Is why this story is so complicated. Sure. One thing that would exonerate Tippit from any involvement in Dealey Plaza, it is theoretically possible for him to have fired a shot and come to Oak Cliff in time, in a police car. However, Mrs. Tippit said her husband came home from lunch that day, and their home was, I think it was 7 miles from Dealey Plaza. It's a long drive, and it's something like 5 miles from where he was shot. And I drove all these routes, to see how long they take. And anyway, but she gave very different accounts over the years. She gave a number of interviews, and her story kept changing about when he was there and how long he stayed home and why he came home. And sometimes she said he never came home. It was very unusual that he came home that day. And other times she said, no, he would come home occasionally to have lunch with us. And the story kept changing, and the time was very unclear. So I was hoping to try to pin down with Mrs. Tippit. Was he really there for lunch? I don't even know for sure if he was. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But the time is important, because if you're going to be downtown shooting the president, you're not going to be home having lunch 7 miles away. So True. I think that story was, and that was put in the paper like that day. That would tend to exonerate Tippit from any suspicion.
Sure.
But that is a big question mark. What happened? What was he doing that day? Why was he home for lunch if he was at all?
Sure. Well, I have a question. If you look at the time, were the Dallas police able to ascertain when Domingo Benavides tried that? Because he apparently clicked something. He didn't know what it was. He wasn't quite sure what he was doing. And supposedly there were some click noises that they think correspond to Domingo Benavides trying to make the police radio
Yeah, I'd have to
transmit, right?
check that. I'd have to check. That's
On the tape.
among the other problems. There was more than one transcript of the police radio. They kept coming up with different transcripts. But I have a tape of the police tape, but that could have been altered as well. But I think there may have been some evidence. I can't recall for sure whether Benavides' attempts were heard at all. But finally, Boley got through, and then he clicked a couple times, and then they said, yes, citizen using the police radio. And he said, there's been an officer shooting. The officer is on the ground. And then I think he tried to call again, and they said, would the citizen please stay off the radio? We're sending people out, etc. But Benavides was just not able to handle the radio. He didn't know how to do it. He was a mechanic.
Sure. Right. So let's look at the theater. And I also want to ask you about Johnny Calvin Brewer, but the theater, you said it could have been possible that they wanted to kill Oswald before Sunday. I would have thought that they had the perfect opportunity in the theater because there weren't too many people there.
Before we leave the Tippit murder scene too, I should go into a couple of other possible reasons for why Tippit drove into an ambush. Because, see, I think one solution could be if they had killed Kennedy, Oswald, and Tippit all within an hour, it would have looked like, genius police work. And some people today even say, well, the Dallas police did a great job. They caught the assassin within an hour and a half and closed the case. I mean, they did a horrible job, and they were involved up to their eyeballs in the plot. But, if they had, one story that went out on the wires was that a policeman was killed in a shootout with somebody on the street in the Oak Cliff area, or another story was that there was a policeman shot downtown. There were some strange stories going out. There was also a story that a Secret Service agent was killed on the street. There may have been some plan to lure Oswald to a certain place where Tippit and he would get into a gunfight and maybe shoot each other, or Tippit would kill Oswald and look like a hero or whatever, and then he actually gets shot. But why would they want to eliminate Tippit? I proved to my satisfaction Tippit was involved in the conspiracy, at least in trying to eliminate Oswald. He'd be an accessory after the fact. We don't know all else that Tippit might have known or been involved in. But they might have sacrificed him in a cynical attempt to get policemen into that area. And as I was mentioning, as Lavelle said, when a policeman is shot, policemen all rush to the area. And so it drained Dealey Plaza downtown of resources. They should have been investigating the president's murder, That's another reason to get policemen to go somewhere else. And they were all really out for blood, to kill the cop killer. And also in a sense, like and it kind of worked in the propaganda sense. And when people thought, well, Oswald's a cop killer, cop killers are terrible people. It probably shows that he killed the president. This is kind of backward logic, because why would you kill a cop if he just pulls you over? Well, he's fleeing a big crime. You just kill the president. He's panicking, but it could have been, it wasn't Oswald at all, but it was another theory is Oswald was somewhere in the vicinity, and they were trying to pin it on him by having people see him nearby and make an inference that he was involved in this police shooting.
Right, but sure. The question I want to ask you is that, don't you? Your basis for stating that there was a conspiracy. Is it speculative, or is there any document that proves it, or testimony to that effect, that actually there was a conspiracy to, concerning killing the president, or concerning? I can understand a conspiracy to cover up because, in the sense of, we don't say that because, man, we look stupid, or we left an unsecured. We basically gave access to a secure facility, and then Oswald gets killed. and let's not say anything about it, or, let's not, be too forthcoming with information about it because it will look bad. But
Well,
which is sort of a conspiracy to CYA, cover your backside.
You're
But
asking, was there a conspiracy to kill the president?
that, yeah, or in
Well,
some ways, in some way, the accessories to it, or
I think there is overwhelming evidence, and for example, the fact that there were shooters firing from different directions is the definition of a conspiracy. More than one shooter,
sure,
and the shots. I remember, as I mentioned in our previous interview, that the first reports for 20 minutes on the radio were the shots came from the front, either from the hill or from the railroad yard. And then they started saying the shots came from behind. And for example, at the press conference that afternoon, the two doctors who treated Kennedy, the principal doctors, both said the shot in his throat was an entrance wound. They said that
right
several times. And then the footage of that has never appeared. It was confiscated, and the transcript disappeared for a long time. But it was reported by the press widely, and then they put pressure on Dr. Perry. Malcolm Perry was the main doctor who treated Kennedy, pronounced him dead, and they threatened him. They were threatening to take away his license, things like that, if he didn't change the story. So he changed the story and said, "Well, I'm not sure." And Kemp Clark was the other doctor who was the head of neurosurgery, and they were very clear that he was shot in the front. Then I found an FBI memo from the evening of November 22nd from A.H. Belmont, who was one of the top guys at the FBI, and he was in charge of the investigation for Hoover. And he said there was a bullet lodged behind the president's ear, and this was dated 9:18 p.m. The official autopsy was underway, and he said there's a bullet lodged behind the president's right ear, and we're getting the bullet. And that disproves the entire Warren theory, because there was no bullet officially found behind the president's ear at the autopsy. The doctors at the autopsy were at a loss to find a bullet. They said they were very concerned they couldn't find a bullet. And it's been proven. Douglas Horne is a very good researcher who worked with the Assassination Records Review Board, and he proved David Lifton's theory that the body was altered secretly. Horne found witnesses, actually, who said that Kennedy's body was altered between 6:55 p.m. and about 7:10, surreptitiously to enlarge the wounds and remove bullets in his head. So there was a bullet behind his ear that was probably the one that blew out the back of his head. And all the witnesses at Parkland Hospital, the doctors and nurses, trained medical people, all said there was one large wound in the back of his head, a big avulsive wound where the brain was seeping out. Nobody saw this big wound in the top of his head or the side of his head that you see on the Zapruder film. Horne also proved that the Zapruder film was altered that weekend by the CIA. They worked on it at a lab in Rochester, New York, a secret lab they had at the Kodak plant. But also, so you have the Dallas witnesses who were reliable medical people, and then the people in Bethesda said the opposite, that there was this gigantic wound that resembled the one that we later saw in the Zapruder film. But there were some people who were witnesses in Bethesda, such as corpsmen and X-ray technicians and other people who helped unwrap the body. And they said there was just the wound in the back of his head. Something happened, the body changed before the official autopsy at 8:15. So it's just some of the proofs of conspiracy, when the body is altered and the direction of the shots are altered, and then the murder weapon is substituted. They first found a Mauser, and then they claimed it was a manual.
Well, I mean, couldn't have just been a case of a misidentification.
Well, it could theoretically could be, although the two deputy sheriffs who identified the weapon knew a lot about weapons. One of them had owned a gun store, and he really knew guns. But yeah, you could start questioning pieces of evidence, and you should. Every piece of evidence should be questioned. But Armstrong proved that there's no proof that Oswald owned this Mannlicher Carcano, and it was also a very bad weapon. It was misaligned, it had a bad sight, and there's a timing problem too. Could one person have fired all the shots in the time that the Zapruder film shows? It's impossible. But the Zapruder film being altered causes question marks about how long the assassination took. Another thing that happened, one reason the film was altered, was the car stopped or came to a kind of a almost stop, which you don't see in the Zapruder film. In the Zapruder film, you see the car slowing down a little and then it takes off. But a lot of witnesses said the car came to a stop or almost a stop. And one of them was Ralph Yarborough, who was a U.S. Senator riding in the car with Lyndon Johnson, 2 cars behind the president. And I interviewed him, and he said the car stopped. And he said Secret Servicemen piled out of the follow-up car and swarmed around the president's car. He said that he thought there was an explosion in the president's car. And none of that is visible in the Zapruder film. And here's a really good witness, a U.S. Senator who was, and also Johnson claimed that the Secret Service agent in the front seat, Rufus Youngblood, jumped over the seat to protect him with his body. This is often repeated, and Robert Caro has it in his latest volume on Johnson. And Yarborough said that never happened. He and Lady Bird and LBJ were in the backseat. He said there was no room for a large man in the backseat. There was barely room for the 3 of us. He said the guy never jumped over the seat. It just didn't happen. But one thing, Penn Jones, who's a Dallas area Maverick newspaper guy, he used to say LBJ was the only person who ducked during the assassination, because there's a famous Associated Press photo taken during the shooting, and you don't see Johnson in the car. You just see Lady Bird and Yarborough waving, and Johnson's head is not visible. So I asked Yarborough what was that about, and he said Johnson was leaning over the front seat. There was a gap between the 2 seats in the front, the driver's seat and the passenger seat. And the Secret Service man was in the right front seat, and he had a walkie-talkie over his arm, a big one. And Johnson was leaning over, huddled with this guy, head to head, listening to the walkie-talkie. And they had 2 radio frequencies within the motorcade. One was just within the motorcade, and the other connected to the White House and the Pentagon and everything. And they were listening to transmissions. And Yarborough also said Johnson acted very strangely all through the motorcade, that he was very quiet and he didn't wave at anybody, and he looked very preoccupied. And there were things.
I mean, the thing is, about that, there's a number of things here that I'd like to mention. I mean, the matter of the rifle. I mean, we of course have the famous backyard photo on,
which is a fraud.
Was it Mercedes Street or McNeely Street of Oswald with a gun?
Neely Street. Mrs. Oswald allegedly took it, but that's an obvious fake. You can look at it. It's easy to prove.
A lot of the people, but there have been people who I think have pushed against that idea.
Well, sure, there are people on all sides who will say, this piece of evidence is real and this is not. But if you look at the picture, there are all kinds of problems with the photograph, with the angle, and Oswald is leaning over in a kind of strange angle, and the shadows don't match, and the rifle isn't right, and he's holding 2 kind of communist publications that are ideologically very different. And the whole thing is very suspicious. And then when they opened up the Dallas police records in the early 90s, they found some very odd pictures of that backyard with no figure in it, but a kind of a cutout where the body is supposed to be. That is it looked like a kind of a stage in a faking a photo, how you could do a composite photograph. It's a pretty obvious. For example, the shadow on Oswald's body goes downward on his face, but the shadow behind him slants in a different direction. It's a ridiculous picture.
Right. I mean, the weapon itself. I mean, this is a topic that there's people who say, for example, that it was the type of munition it used, being that it was at a rounded tip, apparently meant that it rifled better, if you can make a statement like that. I don't know that that's ballistically accurate, but supposedly it was very, very accurate, but it would pass right through a person's body. And so it wouldn't tumble very much, inside the body to cause.
The evidence seems to indicate that
Kennedy, a lot of damage.
He was hit by an explosive bullet that fragmented, which are banned in because it's a war crime to use explosive bullets because they cause terrible damage. And the bullet fragmented, they didn't find a whole bullet except unless you talk about the one that they may have removed from his right temple. Yeah. But the bullet, for example, they could never find any evidence that Oswald had owned or bought any of that kind of weapon. I mean, a bullet. But I found an interesting FBI memo. There are a lot of memos and documents you find that contradict the Warren report. This one said that this bullet was made by the Western Cartridge Company in Ohio, I believe, in the 50s. Right. And the CIA bought something like 2 million bullets from this company. And that's where they traced it to, was the CIA purchase in the 50s. And, first of all, why would you use old bullets, because they could lose their charge, but it's traced to the CIA. I mean, what's that about? In other words, the bullets, there were bullets that were planted. Like there was one that was allegedly found at the hospital, and that's almost certainly a plant. They were trying to plant bullets, and there were cartridges found in the 6th floor of the school book depository. They staged the crime scene to implicate Oswald, to try to link him to this weapon.
Right. Okay. All right. Sure. So you look at Jack Ruby. In your opinion, who is this guy? Is he somebody who, of course, there's some interesting connections, let's say, relationships that, Jack Ruby with these people that were witnesses, or Helen Markham, Booley. Right, maybe some more people, I don't know. Yeah, it was Dallas was kind of like a town compared to today, but still it was pretty big. It had over 500,000 inhabitants. It wasn't. Yeah. It wasn't a one-horse town.
No. It was bigger than Fort Worth, and it was a fairly big. It wasn't as sophisticated or as had beautiful buildings like it does today, but. Jack Ruby was basically the mob connection to the Dallas police. He knew most of the police force. There were hundreds of policemen. And, when you go, one thing I did was, back in the days before the internet, I'd go to the National Archives and I'd go through all the FBI reports that weren't published by the Warren Commission. There were many affidavits from policemen saying, yeah, I knew Jack Ruby. I used to go in his club, and, he would give policemen free drinks and stuff, and women, sure. He was a pimp, he would supply them